Welcome back to TechNet Radio. Ann Vu, Ross Smith, Jeff Mealiffe, and Todd Luttinen are back, and in today's Exchange Ideas episode, they discuss Exchange Server 2013 architecture planning. Tune in as they chat about things you may want to plan for in your environment, such as multi and single namespaces, high availability and site resilience, unified messaging, and virtualization considerations. And the mic is yours.
Hi there, I'm Ann. I'm a technical product manager for the Exchange team, and I'm here with three know-it-alls, Jeff, Ross, and Todd, who know it all about Exchange. At least I hope so. And we're here to talk about Exchange Server 2013 architecture and things customers should start to think about when planning their new Exchange Server 2013 design and architecture and how to deploy the new architecture. So first thing I want to talk about is a question that I get pretty often, which is what should I start to think about in terms of planning and sizing for my Exchange Server 2013 environment, upgrading from either Exchange Server 2007 or 2010?
I think there's a couple of things that customers can start thinking about at this point. We haven't to date actually released our final sizing guidance. We're still in the process of finalizing some of those numbers. But in the interim, I think it's fair to say at this point that we think the process of sizing an Exchange 2013 deployment is going to be very similar to the process used to size an Exchange 2010 all-in-one deployment. When you think about how the mailbox role has changed in 2013, it's in many ways similar to what an all-in-one server would have been in Exchange 2010. And from a resource utilization perspective, that means that sizing is going to be somewhat similar. The numbers themselves will change a bit. We are going to have some additional resource requirements given some additional work that we're doing on that role. But at the same time, we're reducing some of our hardware impact as well, particularly around things like IOPS, similar to what we've done in previous releases with IOPS reductions. So I think probably the best thing to consider at this point is thinking about some of the guidance that we've already provided in some public forums about the hardware that we use internally to deploy Exchange 2013 on as a great starting point. We've certainly have had that type of commodity hardware, like a 2U box with 10 to 20 drives in mind as we went through the development process of the product. And it's a great way to think about planning and sizing, given that we haven't produced guidance that would allow you to extend that to other hardware platforms. Another important thing to do is just keep an eye on the Exchange team blog for that release of sizing guidance, and as well as updates on the release of a calculator that'll make the process much easier. We are going to deliver another calculator just as we did for prior releases.
I can't wait for the calculator. And Ross, you said it's coming out at 2 p.m. sometime in the future.
Yeah. The other thing I think is probably good from a planning perspective is around this notion of a balanced server skew, because that's the way we think of how to design and deploy Exchange these days, is to look at how we can balance the CPU, the memory, and the disks, so that the entire solution is well balanced, well thought out, especially during the worst failure mode possible, and not under-designing the system or even over-designing the system such that you have an excessive amount of one or more resources.
Okay, so if we're talking about it being similar to the Exchange 2010 all-in-one, so now with only two roles, CAS and Mailbox, in the new Exchange Server 2013 architecture, should customers just multi-role?
It certainly is a legitimate option, and it's actually been a point of hot debate internally over the last few months as we've been trying to come up with what our guidance should be around this for customers. There's a couple schools of thought to this. One is that if you multi-role, you end up with likely many more CAS servers than you actually would need for a given deployment. That's a potential administrative overhead expense for managing those additional server instances, but it's still the same number of physical servers regardless. You also end up, when you have more CAS servers, with theoretically the ability to sustain more outages at the CAS layer. So in many ways, you're increasing your availability by doing it. On the flip side, if you think about the it's a potential upgrade path to a future release of Exchange. It's likely, given our new architecture, that you would want your Exchange 2013 CAS servers sitting in front of those next version mailbox servers as part of that upgrade experience. And when you think about separating CAS versus leaving CAS on those mailbox servers, there may be some additional steps you need to take in terms of reusing hardware or switching role installations around a bit. It might make it a little more complicated in terms of that upgrade process. But overall, I think it's a completely legitimate way to deploy both CAS and mailbox on the same hardware. The other guys on the call might have some additional thoughts.
Ross, ideas?
I think Jeff said it eloquently.
Wow, no more words from Ross about that. Okay, well then if I think about multi-role or not multi-role, what about multiple namespaces or having only a single namespace for my environment?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the interesting things about the new architecture in Exchange 2013 is that we do have the capability to change our namespace architecture. We've done a lot of work to simplify the namespace planning. You know, in Exchange 2010, you had at least 7 namespaces in a 2 data center site resilient architecture. You had 2 Internet Protocol namespaces, 1 for each data center. You had 2 OA failback namespaces, 1 in each data center. You had 2 RPC client access service namespaces, 1 in each data center. An auto discover namespace, potentially a legacy namespace, potentially a transport namespace. So a significant number of namespaces to have to manage. With Exchange 2013, you can get down to having a single namespace, one for the entire, for at a minimum for that site resilient data center, if not for a worldwide type of or regional type of approach where you manage it for an entire geography. The reason why that is because of our separation of essentially the separation of client access high availability from the mailbox. From mailbox high availability. The movement of all the protocol rendering back to the mailbox server role has enabled us to be able to have this isolation. And so that way, because of the fact that all that rendering occurs on the mailbox, we just proxy the request from the client access server role. So the client access server in one data center can authenticate that request and simply proxy that request to the mailbox server hosting that active database copy in the secondary data center. This obviously does have some caveats if you wanted to try this type of approach. You need to have the network pipe in between those 2 data centers such that it can sustain essentially 50% of the user traffic being out of sight. So basically the way you would approach this architecture is today, with Exchange 2010 or Exchange 2007, you have essentially a regionalized approach where you have a specific namespace in each data center, a unique namespace in each data center. And if like in Exchange 2010, when you do a data center activation, you change the DNS records to point to the second data center as part of your activation process. So that your end users don't have to learn a new namespace to access their data that's now activated in the secondary data center. You can still take that approach in Exchange 2013. However, you could deploy a single namespace. The way you would deploy this single namespace is you'd have the load balancing VIP virtual IPs be responsive for that single namespace. So that way, any request would be handled by either CAS array, the CAS array in Data Center 1 or the CAS array in Data Center 2, which essentially means that 50% of your traffic will be out of sight from wherever the mailbox is potentially located. That obviously has a huge impact on network planning. You need to make sure you have the throughput and utilization and latency aspects all planned out for that type of approach, but it is something that you could deploy to achieve a single namespace, because we have decoupled the namespace architecture from the mailbox architecture by having all data rendering and data transformation occurring on the mailbox server role, and we're now utilizing the client protocol as the means of proxying the traffic between CAS and mailbox.
There is one additional consideration worth bringing up there that's been very confusing in having this conversation with customers lately, and that's around how load balancing actually works with a single namespace in front of the CAS servers. So as we've talked about removing the need for affinity and being able to simplify load balancer configuration with 2013, the purpose of a load balancer in 2013 in many ways is to provide high availability in front of those CAS servers. And with a single namespace, if you are simplifying your load balancer configuration to the point that you're actually running at layer 4, meaning that that all of those inbound connections to your CAS servers are not actually really being evaluated at all by the load balancer in terms of what the requests are, what the given type of traffic is. In that type of configuration, the load balancer can't actually make decisions at the protocol level about which CAS servers are available to fulfill a particular request. In 2013, we actually have built-in health checking that a load balancer can do on a per protocol basis to determine if OA, ActiveSync, EWS, any of the other protocols we support are actually operational on a CAS server. And with a very simple load balancer deployment, with all the traffic coming in, the load balancer has a very challenging job of looking at all of those protocols and their given health state and trying to figure out whether or not a given request that it knows nothing about should actually be sent to a CAS server. So what this means is that with a single namespace, it may actually require running with a more complex set of load balancer configuration where you're actually terminating the request at the load balancer, examining what those requests are in some level of detail, and potentially even configuring the load balancer similar to what you would have done for 2010 with individual pools for each one of the protocols that are coming into your environment. So it's a trade-off in terms of complexity at different layers in the system.
Okay, if we're talking about that, what about TMG and UAG and publishing?
So that's also another trade-off. So TMG, as I'm sure many of the folks out in the field are aware, TMG is actually no longer being sold by Microsoft, yet it is a product that sits in front of many Exchange deployments around the world today, and is actually pretty well loved by a lot of our customers. And we've had some great guidance over the years that has always said, you need some sort of reverse proxy or security device between your CAS servers and the internet, and TMG was the product of choice in many cases. TMG is absolutely still supported, and for customers who are using TMG today, we encourage them to continue to use it for the lifespan of the product. It'll certainly work just fine in front of Exchange 2013 with some of the guidance that's now available on how to do that. For other customers who don't have TMG, there are certainly other products on the market, and there also is the option of using a less complex device, not necessarily a reverse proxy in between those CAS servers and the internet. It could be some sort of a stateful firewall that's not actually terminating the request, and instead it's just monitoring the traffic between those CAS servers and the internet. We are certainly very familiar with that type of deployment, and we know a lot of customers who've been successful with it as well. So there are options. TMG is absolutely still an option for folks who are happy with it and using it today.
Okay, as I think about customers who are planning their new design, how does the way they think about high availability and site resilience change, and what should they think about for planning HA and SR?
So with high availability, I think one of the changes that comes into play that Todd can go into detail in a little bit, I guess, is around the capability for us to support multiple copies per volume. So that way we've done this to not only deal with the capacity aspects of the eventuality of larger capacity disk drives, but to take advantage and balance the throughput and I/O utilization of those disks as well. So that comes, developing an architecture that can support multiple copies per volume, as well as as taking into consideration the auto reseed capabilities are two areas that you need to consider when thinking about high availability with Exchange 2013, in addition to all the things that we brought into the picture with Exchange 2010, JBOD support, how many copies should you deploy. Our guidance is still around, if you're going to do a site resilient architecture, you should consider 2 copies in each data center as part of your architecture, so that way, regardless of the data center that fails, you still have a highly available architecture that remains to provide that level of availability that your users and business expects. From a site resilient perspective, we've made significant changes. I talked a little bit earlier about the namespace changes. Decoupling the namespace from the mailbox server role and the high availability architecture around the mailbox server role means that we can do things differently from a site resilience perspective. That kind of concept of having a third site or a third data center to have the file share witness in play, so that in the event of a data center outage, we can sustain the loss of those votes from a failover cluster without triggering a loss of quorum. By having that witness in a third location becomes a viable story, because we're now no longer required to manipulate the namespace to get user functionality back up, because the namespace, by doing a single namespace and pre-configuring all that, the namespace just happens automatically as part of that activation. Well, it doesn't really happen as part of any activation. It's part of the normal day-to-day operations. So that introduces some new capability there with site resilience. I don't know if Todd wants to add anything.
Yeah, I could certainly add that, just to highlight on the point on multiple database copies per volume, one of the great benefits that brings about is the ability to distribute the active user load across all of the available storage across all the servers hosting those database copies, thereby spreading that load a little bit more evenly and having smaller units of failover when individual disks fail or when a server fails and the resulting users on that server are redistributed to the remaining copies.
Okay, so if we're talking about HA, what about transport HA and safety net? How does that work, and how does that affect my architecture?
So transport has evolved as well in Exchange 2013. We've introduced the concept of delivery groups, and delivery groups really just define the next hop in the delivery process. But a new delivery group in Exchange 2013 is the DAG in of itself. And what this essentially means is that we route messages to get to the DAG, and the DAG becomes our unit of high availability. Not only for the mailbox data residing in the mailbox database, but it becomes our unit of high availability for transport as well. Once a message arrives onto the transport service on a mailbox server role, we will attempt to make a copy of that message and what we refer to now as safety net, another copy of that message. This is what we used to refer to as transport dumpster in the past 2 releases, but it's evolved significantly in Exchange 2013. When, if you have a site resilient architecture, when we go to make this shadow copy of the message, we will prefer to place that shadow copy in the other Active Directory site, thereby giving you site resilience from a transport perspective, so that in the event that we have to do a transport redelivery request, we can request it from either Active Directory site, and even if one of the Active Directory sites is no longer responsive because that's the failed data center, we can still redeliver those requests. We've also enhanced other recovery scenarios. The lag database copy, as an example, can now do transport redelivery requests through SafetyNet. So that way it can recover some of the lost data based on when you activate that database copy from its point in time.
Okay, and another question I get is, how do customers isolate functionality? So some people have asked if they can turn off on the mailbox server if they're not deploying How might they be able to do that? Or is that even important?
Ideally, it shouldn't be important. Ideally, the server should work great out of the box and handle balancing the needs of all the different components on the box. There's definitely some engineering work that went in Exchange 2013 around workload management to try and get the best utilization of the hardware possible, while isolating, or I guess allocating hardware resources for more important work, like actually servicing user requests, and deprioritizing things that can happen later on. So it shouldn't be necessary to actually turn some of these things off. The server should work great out of the box. I guess that would be the default guidance from the product group. We certainly test with everything enabled. That's the configuration that we know the best.
Okay, and so if I'm just thinking about architecture and how I might plan my new Exchange Server 2013 implementation, should I think about virtualization? Is that a good option?
So virtualization is an option, just as it has been in prior releases of Exchange, and we've effectively carried forward the same guidance that we had for Exchange 2010 around virtualization of Exchange Server 2013. I do think that with the consolidation of components and processes into the mailbox role, that there's for organizations of any sort of scale where you're going to have multiple Exchange servers, and actually be able to utilize the hardware for a few Exchange servers or more, that a physical deployment is going to make more sense. We're designed to really be able to take full advantage of physical hardware in 2013 with that mailbox role architecture change, and adding a virtualization layer underneath that, underneath the operating system and sitting on top of the hardware is really in many ways just adding additional complexity, additional cost, additional management overhead. So we don't think that necessarily makes sense. There could be reasons for a particular scenario where it might make sense, but in general, we think we'll do best on physical. There are certainly cases at the lower end with a very small number of users, where in order to get high availability, it might make sense to co-locate Exchange virtual machines with other workloads in order to take best advantage of hardware. I think a good argument there would be that the cloud actually might be a great option for a small deployment like that as well, and actually just eliminate the need to manage those virtual machines entirely from that environment. So yeah, virtualization is an option. We don't think it's a necessity.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you guys very much for discussing architecture and planning with me today. Hopefully customers will be able to have the good points to think about how they might want to plan their new Exchange Server 2013 architecture. So thanks again to Jeff, Ross, and Todd.